The console glowed amber at 3:47 a.m. 12 toggle switches, 6 VU meters bouncing in silence, and a rotary dial calibrated in kilohertz. The air tasted like solder flux and cigarette smoke that had soaked into cork ceiling tiles for 30 years. Outside, Lincoln, Nebraska, slept under a January sky so clear you could see the Milky Way between the tower lights. The technician's fingers moved across the board without looking, a muscle memory built from 10,000 midnight shifts, each one identical to the last, each one keeping 48,000 square miles of farmland connected to the world. The transmitter room hummed at 120 decibels, a frequency that lived in your sternum long after your shift ended. On the wall, a clipboard held FCC violation reports dating back to 1967, each one initialed, each one a map of everything that could go wrong when you were the only person standing between signal and silence. This wasn't a job. This was being the last voice before the emergency broadcast system kicked in. Were you infrastructure, or were you already a ghost? Durasa, Chapter 1, The Tower People. In 1952, there were 2,331 AM radio stations operating in the United States, and every single one required a human being to sit in a transmitter building through the hours when most of America was unconscious. They called themselves tower people, studio people, board operators, but the federal designation was simpler: radio telephone first-class operator. You needed one on premises whenever the transmitter was live. No exceptions. The FCC didn't care if you were sick, snowed in, or losing your mind from sleep deprivation. If that carrier wave was broadcasting, a licensed technician had to be watching it. The transmitter buildings sat in farm fields, industrial zones, and alongside highways, always remote, always alone. The towers themselves rose 300 to 1,500 feet, requiring aircraft warning lights that had to be checked every 4 hours. You climbed in wind, ice, rain, and darkness. A burned-out bulb could mean a $10,000 fine or a plane crash. Both had happened. In Kansas, in 1958, a Cessna hit an unlighted tower at 11:20 p.m. The technician on duty had called in the light failure 6 hours earlier. The replacement bulb was still in a warehouse in Omaha. They worked what the industry called combo shifts engineer, janitor, security guard, and the last line of defense against dead air. Dead air was the cardinal sin. 3 seconds of silence, and the switchboard lit up. 30 seconds, and the station manager was driving to the site. 3 minutes, and the FCC started asking questions that ended careers. So, you learned to sleep in 15-minute increments, one ear always on the monitor speaker. Your body trained to wake at the first flutter in the carrier wave. The pay in 1952 was $1.85 an hour for overnight shifts at small market stations. Larger markets paid $240. You worked alone. You worked scared. And you worked knowing that if the transmitter arced, if the high voltage supply shorted, if any of the 200 vacuum tubes inside that cabinet decided to fail at 3 a.m., you were the only one who could fix it before sunrise and the morning news block. The FCC manual was 600 pages long. Page 34 explained what happened if you left your post. Gertjer, Chapter 2, The Mathematics of Overnight. Between 1950 and 1965, the radio industry operated on a staffing model that assumed human endurance was infinite. Overnight shifts ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. hours on paper, but no technician worked exactly 8 hours. You arrived early to relieve the evening operator. You stayed late to brief the morning crew. The actual time on site averaged 9.5 hours, 6 nights a week. Some stations ran 7-day schedules. The human cost showed up in FCC incident reports. Between 1953 and 1962, there were 847 documented cases of overnight technicians falling asleep at the console, resulting in violations ranging from brief dead air to complete signal loss. In Memphis, in 1959, a technician slept through a transmitter fire that burned for 40 minutes before a passing motorist called the fire department. The station lost its license for 90 days. The technician lost his career. Sleep science in 1955 didn't exist as a public health field, but the radio technicians knew what the doctors hadn't quantified yet. The human circadian system cannot adapt to permanent night shifts. You could survive them. You couldn't thrive in them. After 6 months of overnight work, your cortisol patterns inverted. After a year, your short-term memory started degrading. After 3 years, you became someone your wife no longer recognized during the 16 waking hours you spent together each week. The industry response was coffee. Industrial-strength Maxwell House in 40-cup urns, brewed at sunset and kept hot until dawn. The average overnight technician consumed 8 to 12 cups per shift. Some stations kept Benzedrine inhalers in the first aid kit legal, encouraged and devastating to cardiovascular systems that were already operating under constant low-level stress. A transmitter building at 3 a.m. was a sensory deprivation chamber punctuated by catastrophe. 95% of your shift was silence, monitoring, and waiting. The other 5% was emergency response under conditions that would violate every OSHA standard written after 1970. A tube failure at 50,000 watts could send a voltage spike through the entire building. Arc flash burns were common enough that most technicians carried a tube of unguentine in their toolbox, next to the diagonal cutters and the log sheets. The FCC required you to make an entry every hour. They never asked what you did between entries. DARPA, Chapter 3. The invisible grid radio wasn't entertainment in 1950. It was the central nervous system of American civilian life. Before the interstate highway system, before reliable long-distance telephone service outside major cities, before television reached beyond the urban coasts, radio was how the country knew itself. Weather warnings, crop prices, election results, civil defense alerts, all of it moved through AM frequencies that required constant human calibration. The Clear Channel stations, not the corporation, but the original 50 AM stations authorized to broadcast at 50,000 watts on protected frequencies, could reach 30 states on a clear night. WSM in Nashville, WLW in Cincinnati, KMOX in St. Louis, WGN in Chicago. Each one had a transmitter building the size of a small warehouse and a technical staff that worked in rotating shifts around the clock. If WSM went dark, half the South lost its weather service. The regional stations, there were 2,800 of them by 1960, operated at lower power but higher consequence. They served single counties, small cities, farm communities that had no backup. When a transmitter failed in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, or Amarillo, Texas, or Butte, Montana, the technician on duty wasn't just fixing a radio station. He was restoring the primary communication system for 60,000 people. This created a specific kind of psychological pressure. You weren't responsible for the signal. You were the signal. Your attention was the only thing standing between a community and isolation. The farmers listening for wheat prices at 5 a.m., the truckers navigating by radio beacon, the civil defense network that used AM stations as relay points for emergency broadcasts, all of them assumed you were awake, competent, and watching the meters. Between 1950 and 1965, the United States averaged 2.3 million radio technician hours per month. Almost all of them worked alone, at night, in buildings with no backup systems and no margin for error. The National Association of Broadcasters called it the invisible grid. The technicians called it something simpler: the job that ended when you died, or when the industry changed enough that dying at the console stopped being a statistical possibility. By 1962, there were 43 documented cases of technicians found dead at their posts. Natural causes mostly: heart attacks, strokes, aneurysms. The FCC never investigated whether the work accelerated the dying. Relied, Chapter 4. The hours that didn't belong to them. Time fragmented differently for overnight workers. Days became voids. Sleep deprivation produces memory gaps that turn waking hours into discontinuous scenes. You'd finish a shift at 7 a.m., drive home through rush hour traffic, moving in the opposite direction of your consciousness. Sleep from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. in a bedroom where your children had learned to play silently. Wake to a house that felt like a museum of a life you were no longer living. Eat breakfast at 4 p.m. and return to the transmitter building by 10 p.m. to prepare for the next 8 hours of isolation. The marriage statistics were catastrophic but unpublished. In a 1963 survey conducted by the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, 67% of radio technicians working permanent overnight shifts reported severe marital strain. 41% were divorced or separated within 5 years of taking an overnight position. The union recommended rotation, 2 weeks of day shifts, 2 weeks of overnight, but most small market stations couldn't afford the staffing depth. You took the overnight job because it was the only job. You kept it because walking away meant losing your FCC license, your union card, and any chance of working in broadcasting again. Children grew up with phantom fathers, men who slept through school plays, parent-teacher conferences, birthday parties, and holiday dinners because their circadian rhythm was permanently inverted. The technical term is shift work sleep disorder, but it wasn't diagnosed as a medical condition until 1990. For 40 years, it was just understood that overnight technicians were tired, irritable, and gradually vanishing from their own families. Some stations tried to compensate with differential pay an extra 25 cents per hour for overnight shifts. At a 48-hour work week, that translated to an extra $12 before taxes. Not enough to make the work bearable, but enough to make quitting feel like financial suicide if you had a mortgage and 3 children under 10. The social isolation compounded everything. Day shift technicians had colleagues. Evening shift technicians had the on-air staff. Overnight technicians had the transmitter hum, the coffee urn, and whatever ghosts accumulated in a building where human consciousness flickered like a failing tube. Some talked to themselves. Some talked to the equipment. A few talked to God, though whether that was prayer or psychosis depended on who you asked. The FCC log required your initials every hour on the hour. It didn't require proof you were still sane. Relied, Chapter 5. The Technical Liturgy. Every transmitter had a personality, not metaphorically literally. The 50,000-watt RCA BTA-50H installed at WLW in Cincinnati had a specific sequence of startup sounds that veteran technicians could diagnose from 3 rooms away. The Gates BC5P transmitters, common in regional markets, would develop harmonic distortions that manifested as a low howl at exactly 2:30 a.m. every night, for reasons no engineer ever fully documented. You learned your transmitter the way a pilot learns an aircraft through repetition, failure, and the knowledge that any deviation from expected behavior could mean hours of troubleshooting in the middle of the night. The maintenance cycle was religious in its precision. Every morning at 7 a.m., the overnight technician performed a going-off ritual. Check all meter readings, log any anomalies, verify that the modulation peaks hadn't exceeded 100%, confirm that the tower lights were functioning, and brief the day shift operator on anything that had happened during the night. Then you reverse the process at 11 p.m., taking verbal and written handoff from the evening operator who had taken handoff from the day operator, creating an unbroken chain of custody over the signal that stretched back to the station's first broadcast. The tube replacement schedule alone required encyclopedic knowledge. A typical 5,000-watt transmitter contained 46 vacuum tubes, each with a different function and failure pattern. The 833A power amplifier tubes lasted 6 months under normal conditions, 3 months if you were running the transmitter hot to compensate for a weak signal. The 4400A modulator tubes were good for 18 months, but had to be monitored weekly for gas buildup. A blue glow at the plate meant imminent failure. The 6L6 tubes in the audio chain could last 5 years or 5 days depending on nothing anyone could predict. You kept a tube stock in a climate-controlled cabinet, $4,000 worth of glass and wire that represented the difference between signal continuity and catastrophic failure. Insurance didn't cover tube stock. If the building burned, if someone broke in and vandalized the equipment, if a power surge destroyed half your inventory, you absorbed the loss. Some technicians bought tubes with personal credit at electronics distributors in Omaha or Kansas City, driving 6 hours round trip because waiting for mail order meant risking dead air. The technical manuals were sacred texts. The RCA Broadcast Transmitter Manual, 1952 edition, ran 1,847 pages and covered every component in excruciating detail, not because RCA was thorough, but because the FCC required documentation for every modification, repair, and parts replacement. You signed and dated every entry. Inspectors could audit your logs going back 7 years. A single undocumented repair could result in a fine, a license suspension, or both. The transmitter didn't care if you understood it. It only cared that you kept it running. Chapter 6. The weather and the dying lightning was the existential threat. Between April and September, overnight technicians watched the western horizon with the attention most people reserve for armed intruders. A thunderstorm 15 miles away could send a voltage surge through the transmission line that destroyed $30,000 worth of equipment in less than a second. The lightning arresters installed at every professional transmitter site were rated for 100,000 volts. Summer storms in the Midwest routinely exceeded 300,000 volts. In July 1961, a storm system moving across eastern Kansas hit 12 radio stations in 6 hours. At KFRM in Concordia, the lightning strike blew the main power transformer off its pole mount and sent a fireball through the transmitter room that burned the overnight technician badly enough to require skin grafts on his hands and forearms. He was back at work 8 weeks later. The station was back on the air in 4 days, operating at reduced power from a backup transmitter trucked in from Wichita. The FCC fine for being dark during storm season was $1,000 per day. Rebuilding the transmitter cost $38,000. The technician's medical bills totaled $40,200, of which the station covered $1,800. Winter ice was slower, but just as fatal. Tower ice accumulation could add 15 tons of weight to a structure never designed to carry it. The aircraft warning lights, already precarious at the top of a 1,500-foot tower, became unreachable once ice built up beyond 6 inches. The standard procedure was to wait for a thaw. The FCC procedure was to climb. In January 1958, a technician at Kexel in Waterloo, Iowa, climbed to replace a burned-out beacon bulb in 12-degree weather with ice on every rung of the tower ladder. He made it to the 800-foot level before hypothermia set in. They found him the next morning, frozen to the ladder at the 600-foot level, still clipped to the safety line. The station received a commendation from the FCC for maintaining tower light compliance during adverse weather conditions. The phrase adverse weather conditions appeared in 11% of all FCC incident reports filed between 1950 and 1965. It covered lightning strikes, ice storms, tornadoes, floods, and one incident in North Dakota where a blizzard buried the transmitter building under 9 feet of snow, and the overnight technician lived on canned soup and transmitter heat for 4 days until a county plow could reach him. The weather didn't negotiate. Neither did the FCC. Chapter 7. The Strike That Never Happened. In 1956, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers attempted to organize overnight radio technicians into a collective bargaining unit that could demand shift rotation, hazard pay, and mandatory backup staffing. The campaign lasted 7 months, reached 4,400 technicians across 38 states, and failed. The failure wasn't about union busting, though station owners fought it viciously. It failed because overnight technicians couldn't strike. The FCC regulations were explicit. Abandoning a transmitter while it was broadcasting was willful or malicious interference with radio communication under Section 333 of the Communications Act of 1934. Federal offense, prison time, permanent loss of license. The IBEW argued that a coordinated walkout simultaneous across all stations in a given market wouldn't be abandonment, it would be labor action. The FCC declined to issue a ruling, which meant the threat of prosecution remained active. 3 technicians in Cincinnati tested it by walking off their overnight shifts on the same night in September 1956. All 3 were arrested within 12 hours. 2 served 30 days in county jail. The third lost his license and never worked in broadcasting again. The leverage didn't exist. Station owners knew it. Technicians knew it. The union knew it. You could ask for better conditions, but you couldn't enforce demands because the enforcement mechanism withholding labor was criminalized at the federal level. So the conditions didn't improve. The pay barely moved. By 1965, the average overnight technician at a small market station was making $2.15 an hour, which adjusted for inflation was less purchasing power than the $1.85 they'd made in 1952. Meanwhile, the FCC had added new technical requirements: stereo broadcasting, emergency broadcast system compliance, expanded logging mandates. Each one added workload. None added staff. A few stations tried voluntary improvements. WGN in Chicago implemented a rotation system in 1959, where no technician worked more than 2 consecutive overnight shifts. The experiment lasted 6 months before budget cuts eliminated the extra positions. KMOX in St. Louis built sleeping quarters into the transmitter building. A cot, a blanket, and a space heater in a back room so technicians could rest during dead air windows. The FCC cited them for insufficient operator attentiveness after an inspector arrived unannounced at 4 a.m. and found the overnight tech asleep. The rules required you to be awake. They didn't require the work to be survivable. Thorsen, Chapter 8. The Numbers That Built the Grid. By 1960, The United States had 398 AM radio stations operating under FCC license. Each station required, on average, 3.2 technical staff members to maintain 24-hour operation. That's 10,874 radio technicians working shifts around the clock, maintaining a broadcast infrastructure that reached 96.4% of American households. The overnight shifts 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. represented 33.3% of all broadcast hours but employed 44.7% of all technical labor, because overnight positions had higher turnover and required more frequent replacement. The average tenure of an overnight technician at a small market station was 18 months. At large market stations, with better pay and rotation systems, it was 34 months. The attrition rate was 61% annually. Injury rates were never formally compiled because the FCC didn't track them and OSHA didn't exist until 1971. But insurance data from the National Association of Broadcasters shows that radio technicians filed claims at a rate of 8.2 injuries per 100 full-time workers per year, double the rate of general electricians, triple the rate of office workers, and roughly equivalent to light manufacturing. The specific injury types clustered around electrical shock, 41% of all claims, falls from towers, 23%, and burns from transmitter equipment, 18%. The remaining 18% were categorized as other, which included everything from carbon monoxide poisoning in poorly ventilated transmitter buildings to psychological breakdowns that resulted in hospitalization. Wages told their own story. In 1960, the median annual income for a radio technician working overnight shifts at a small market station was $4,472. The median income for all American workers that year was $4,007. The overnight differential and extra, 465 hours, annually worked out to 0.22 per hour over a 2,080-hour work year. You were paid 22 cents more per hour to work alone at night in a building full of high-voltage equipment with no backup and no margin for error. By 1965, automation was beginning to appear in larger markets. Pre-recorded programming, automatic transmitter monitoring systems, and remote control technology that let a technician supervise the transmitter from a central studio location. These systems cost between $30,000 and $75,000 to install, more than most small market stations grossed in a year. But the cost calculus was obvious. One automation system could replace 2 overnight technicians, saving $9,000 annually in labor costs and eliminating liability for workplace injuries. The numbers said you were expensive. The numbers said you were replaceable. The numbers never said you were essential, even though the entire system collapsed without you. Chapter 9. The ones who stayed there were men who worked overnight shifts for 20 years, 30 years. A few made it to 40. They weren't masochists or failures. They were the ones who found a strange peace in the isolation, who learned to live in the space between 11 p.m. and sunrise like it was a country with different laws. They developed routines so precise they bordered on ritual. Coffee at 11:15 p.m., first log entry at midnight, transmitter readings at 12:30 a.m. Walk the perimeter at 1 a.m. to check the tower lights, back inside by 1:15 a.m. Read for an hour technical manuals, westerns, whatever kept the mind engaged without demanding too much. Second coffee at 3 a.m. When the circadian crash hit hardest, monitor the modulation peaks through the overnight programming, watching for the signature patterns of worn tubes or failing capacitors. Some kept notebooks, not the official FCC logs, but personal records of anomalies, patterns, near misses. One technician in Cheyenne, Wyoming, maintained a journal for 23 years, documenting every unusual event. Strange noises in the transmitter, unexplained power fluctuations, moments when the equipment seemed to respond to his presence. When he retired in 1979, his notebooks filled 2 cardboard boxes. The station threw them away during an office cleaning in 1982. The long-term overnight men developed a specific relationship with fear. Not the acute fear of a lightning strike or a tube explosion, but a chronic, low-grade awareness that you were always one mistake away from catastrophe. You learned to live with it the way miners learn to live with the weight of rock overhead. It never left you, but you learned to function around it, inside it. Their marriages, when they survived, were strange architectures. Wives who learned to sleep alone, to parent alone, to make every major decision alone because their husband was present for maybe 60 waking hours a week, and half of those hours he was too exhausted to engage. Some wives took on second shifts themselves, working nights at hospitals or factories, so the family could still have dinner together at 9 p.m. before both parents vanished into their respective darknesses. The children of long-term overnight technicians often reported feeling like their fathers were ghosts, present in the house during daylight hours, but unconscious, unreachable, existing in a different temporal plane. They learned to be quiet between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. They learned that weekends didn't mean family time because Dad still worked Friday and Saturday nights. They learned that holidays were negotiable around the broadcast schedule, which didn't acknowledge Christmas or Easter or Thanksgiving as anything more than a programming note. The ones who stayed didn't stay because the work was good. They stayed because leaving required imagining a different version of themselves. And after 20 years of overnight shifts, imagination was the first thing that died. Chapter 10. The Automation. Revelation. In 1962, WGMS in Washington, D.C. became the first commercial radio station in the United States to operate entirely without a human being in the transmitter building during overnight hours. The system, manufactured by Schaefer Electronics, used a series of electromechanical relays and preset timers to play pre-recorded programming, monitor transmitter function, and shut down the station if any parameter exceeded safe limits. The FCC approved it conditionally. A licensed technician had to be reachable by telephone, able to reach the transmitter site within 30 minutes, and responsible for any violations that occurred during unmanned operation. The station paid the overnight technician $80 per week to sleep at home with a phone next to his bed. He was called out 4 times in the first year, twice for false alarms caused by faulty sensors. By 1965, 47 stations had installed automation systems. By 1970, that number was 9 and 12. The technology was crude tape loops, mechanical switches, vacuum tube logic, but it worked well enough to eliminate the need for a human being to sit in an empty building for 8 hours, watching meters that rarely changed. The technicians who lost their overnight positions didn't all move to day shifts. The industry was contracting even as it automated. FM broadcasting was growing, and FM required different technical expertise, solid-state electronics, stereo processing, higher frequencies that behaved differently in the atmosphere. Some overnight AM technicians retrained. Some left broadcasting entirely. A surprising number simply disappeared from the employment records, their FCC licenses lapsing, their union memberships canceled for non-payment of dues. The union response was muted because the union had never been strong in radio. The IBEW had members in radio, but most overnight technicians weren't organized. They worked as individual employees of small corporations that operated 1 or 2 stations, and individual employees don't have leverage. By the time automation arrived, Most overnight men were too exhausted to fight it. A few were relieved, but automation didn't eliminate the overnight technical role, it transformed it. The new model was the on-call technician. You didn't sit in the building, but you carried a pager, later a cell phone, and you responded when the automation system failed, which it did frequently, especially in the early years. You worked unpredictable hours for less pay and no benefits because you were no longer a full-time employee. You were a contractor, paid per call-out, with no guarantee of how many call-outs you'd get in a given week. The overnight shift didn't end. It metastasized into something harder to see, harder to quantify, and easier for the industry to ignore. The automation didn't replace you. It turned you into a ghost who only appeared when something broke. Shopper, Chapter 11. The things they never told anyone. Some nights the transmitter room was colder than the air outside, even with the heat from the tubes. Psychologists later identified this as a symptom of extreme fatigue, thermoregulation failure, caused by chronic sleep deprivation. But in the moment, at 4 a.m., it felt like the building was rejecting you. Some technicians heard voices in the carrier wave hum. Not words exactly, but patterns that sounded almost like speech if you listened long enough. Most didn't mention it, because mentioning it meant a psychological evaluation, and a psychological evaluation meant losing your license. So you kept it to yourself, the same way you kept the hand tremor, the short-term memory gaps, the mornings when you couldn't remember driving home. A few saw things. Shadows moving in the transmitter room when no one else was there. Figures standing at the far end of the building, visible for a second before the fluorescent lights flickered and they were gone. The official explanation was hypnagogic hallucinations, the brain generating dream imagery while technically awake, a common symptom of severe sleep deprivation. The unofficial explanation, the one that spread in break rooms and union halls, was that transmitter buildings accumulated something from all those hours of human isolation. Not ghosts exactly, more like psychic residue. There were transmitter sites with reputations, buildings where technicians refused to work alone, where the overnight shift rotated weekly because no one could handle more than a few nights before requesting a transfer. The FCC logs never mentioned fear. They mentioned equipment reliability issues and persistent technical anomalies and difficulty maintaining qualified staff. But the technicians knew. In 1963, a technician at Coma in Oklahoma City reported that the transmitter would shut down at exactly 3:17 a.m. every Tuesday for 6 consecutive weeks. Engineers from RCA spent 4 days testing every component and found nothing wrong. The shutdown stopped after the station hired a second, overnight technician to work a split shift. The official explanation was intermittent grounding fault. The technician who'd been working alone said he'd felt something in the building on those Tuesday nights, a pressure change, a sense of presence. He transferred to a day shift position 2 months later. These stories didn't make it into industry journals or technical manuals. They circulated person to person, told in the 10-minute handoff between shifts, shared at union meetings after the official business concluded. No one investigated because investigating required admitting the stories existed, and admitting the stories existed meant admitting that the work damaged people in ways that went beyond statistics and injury reports. The grounded explanation, chronic isolation plus sleep deprivation, produces predictable psychological effects. The other explanation, some places remember what happens in them, especially when what happens is suffering. Neither explanation changed the requirement that you work alone. 3. Chapter 12. The Scale of the System. By 1970, the American radio infrastructure represented 50 million hours of cumulative human attention annually. That's not broadcast hours. That's technical supervision hours. Engineers watching transmitters, technicians maintaining equipment, operators logging readings, all of it adding up to a staggering investment of human consciousness pointed at the singular goal of keeping the electromagnetic spectrum populated with signals. The overnight technicians represented roughly 18 million of those hours. 18 million hours of human beings sitting in transmitter buildings during the hours when the country slept. That's 2,054 years of continuous human attention, measured in calendar time. All of it spent maintaining a communication system that most Americans never thought about and couldn't see. This wasn't incidental labor. This was the foundation that made every other form of American communication possible. Weather forecasts that let farmers plan planting schedules. Emergency broadcasts that warned coastal towns about hurricanes. Election results that reached every county in every state by sunrise the morning after polls closed. The entire system depended on human beings willing to work alone, at night, under conditions that would have horrified industrial safety advocates if those advocates had known to look. The economic scale was equally staggering. Radio broadcasting in 1970 was a $1.6 billion industry, roughly equivalent to $12.5 billion today. The overnight technical labor that made that industry possible consumed less than 2% of total revenue, approximately $32 million annually, split across 10,000 plus technicians. The average overnight technician was paid $6,400 per year in 1970. The average station general manager was paid $42,000. The productivity metrics were obscene. A single overnight technician, working alone, supervised equipment that generated signals reaching between 50,000 and 5 million people, depending on transmitter power and atmospheric conditions. At a clear channel station like WLW or WSM, one human being was responsible for maintaining signal integrity across 30 states, 45% of the continental United States, 60 million people, all depending on one person's ability to stay awake and competent through the circadian nadir of human consciousness. This created a specific kind of leverage that the technicians never used, because they couldn't. If every overnight AM technician in America had walked off the job simultaneously, the entire broadcast system would have collapsed within hours. Emergency communications would have failed. The civil defense network would have gone dark. Half the country would have lost access to news, weather, and the cultural continuity that radio provided. But they couldn't walk off because the law made it a federal crime. And the law made it a federal crime because the system was too important to allow labor disruption, which meant the technicians were trapped in a logic loop. Essential enough to criminalize their strikes, not essential enough to pay them well or protect them from the cumulative damage of the work. Between 1950 and 1980, American radio technicians maintained 96% uptime across the entire AM broadcast band. The only infrastructure system with better reliability was the electrical grid, and the electrical grid had backup systems. Tamakurushi Chapter 13, The Body Count. The phrase "died at his post" appears in 17 FCC incident reports filed between 1950 and 1975. All 17 involved overnight technicians. 11 were cardiac events, heart attacks, or strokes. 3 were electrical accidents that proved fatal. 2 were classified as unknown medical emergency. 1 was a fall from a tower during an overnight bulb replacement. The cardiac deaths clustered in specific age ranges, 48 to 62 years old, which aligned with the typical career arc of someone who'd worked overnight shifts for 20 to 30 years. Chronic sleep disruption, compounded by high-stress emergency response, amplified by decades of coffee and Benzedrine and whatever else kept you conscious through the worst hours, produced cardiovascular systems that failed earlier and faster than the general population. The electrical deaths were usually catastrophic full voltage exposure from touching live components during troubleshooting, or arc flash incidents that occurred when opening transmitter cabinets that should have been de-energized but weren't. In most cases, the technician was found dead at the console or on the floor next to the equipment, still holding the tool they'd been using when the current found a path through their body. The fall death happened in Amarillo in 1968. Ice on the tower, a burned-out beacon bulb, a technician who'd climbed in darkness because the FCC required beacon lights operational during overnight hours. He fell from 400 feet. The FCC report noted that the tower lights were restored to compliance 12 hours after the incident. It did not note whether the technician had a family. These 17 deaths were documented because they occurred at FCC-licensed facilities during active broadcast periods. The deaths that occurred later, the heart attacks that hit 5 years after retirement, the strokes that killed men in their 50s who'd left overnight work, but whose bodies never recovered from the damage, those didn't get counted. Neither did the suicides, which were never tracked as an occupational category, but which appeared in obituaries with disturbing frequency. After a brief illness was common. Suddenly at home was common. The phrase "long-time radio technician" appeared in dozens of obituaries that implied but never stated the mechanism of death. In 1978, a cardiologist in Minnesota published a small study comparing cardiovascular health in rotating shift workers versus permanent night shift workers. He found that permanent night shift workers had a 43% higher rate of heart disease and a 37% higher rate of early mortality. The study sample included radio technicians, but didn't isolate them as a separate category. No follow-up study was ever conducted. The industry never commissioned a comprehensive occupational health study. Neither did the FCC. Neither did any federal agency responsible for worker safety. The overnight radio technician simply wasn't visible enough as a demographic category to justify the research funding. There weren't enough of them. They weren't organized, and by the time someone might have studied them, automation had already begun erasing them from the workforce. The deaths were documented. The dying was ignored. And the difference between those two things is how you calculate what a society values. Chapter 14. The Ghosts in the Machine. By 1975, automation was sophisticated enough that most overnight technical work had migrated from continuous presence to emergency response. The transmitters ran themselves, monitored by sensors and logic circuits that could detect failures and shut down safely before catastrophic damage occurred. The technician's role became diagnostic and corrective. You showed up when the automation failed, which meant you showed up in the middle of the night, often with no warning, to troubleshoot systems you hadn't seen in weeks. This created a new kind of knowledge crisis. The old overnight men had known their transmitters intimately, every quirk, every failure pattern, every sound that meant trouble. The new on-call technicians serviced multiple sites, often for multiple stations, and they knew the equipment theoretically but not personally. They followed flowcharts and diagnostic procedures printed in manuals that assumed you'd been working with the equipment daily. The failure rate stayed roughly constant, but the repair time increased. A tube replacement that would have taken the old overnight man 15 minutes because he knew exactly which tube was failing, based on the sound, now took the on-call technician 90 minutes because he had to test every component systematically to isolate the problem. The stations tolerated it because the labor cost was still lower than maintaining full-time overnight staff. But something was lost that went beyond efficiency. The overnight men had maintained a relationship with the equipment that bordered on superstition. They knew when a transmitter was going to fail, not through sensor readings, but through subtle changes in behavior that no diagnostic equipment could detect. A slight shift in the hum frequency, a barely perceptible flutter in the plate current. They'd learned to trust those intuitions because ignoring them meant getting called out 3 hours later when the transmitter died. The on-call technicians didn't develop that knowledge because they didn't have the contact hours. They responded to failures, not warnings. This made the work more reactive, more stressful, and less predictable. You could go 2 weeks without a call-out, then get 3 in one night. The stations paid per call-out, not per hour, which meant your income was as unpredictable as the equipment. The psychological profile changed too. The old overnight men had been solitary, detail-obsessed, capable of functioning in isolation for extended periods. The on-call technicians were troubleshooters, problem solvers who arrived at crisis points, fixed what was broken, and left. They didn't sit with the equipment. They didn't develop theories about what the transmitter wanted. They didn't hear voices in the carrier wave because they weren't there long enough for the isolation to deform their perception. Whether this was progress depended on who you asked. The stations saved money. The technicians worked fewer hours and had more predictable home lives. But the tribal knowledge, the accumulated understanding of how these machines actually behaved under stress, disappeared as the old overnight men retired and the new on-call model became standard. You can automate presence. You can't automate understanding. The distinction didn't matter until the systems failed in ways the automation couldn't anticipate. Chapter 15. The End of the License. In 1981, the FCC eliminated the requirement for a first-class radio telephone license for most broadcast operations. The technical justification was that solid-state transmitters were more reliable and required less specialized knowledge to maintain. The practical effect was that stations could hire cheaper labor without the 2 years of technical training and federal certification that the old license required. The overnight technician, as a specialized role, effectively ended within 5 years. By 1986, most AM stations operated with general broadcast engineers who handled everything from transmitter maintenance to studio equipment repair to IT support, working day shifts, or on-call as needed. The overnight shift, when it existed at all, was staffed by part-time board operators with minimal technical training, responsible for watching automated systems and calling someone if anything went wrong. The men who'd held first-class licenses, thousands of them, found themselves suddenly obsolete. Their specialized knowledge, earned through years of correspondence courses and FCC examinations and hands-on experience, was now less valuable than a 2-day seminar on solid-state transmitter maintenance. Some adapted, learning the new equipment and accepting lower pay. Many left broadcasting entirely. A few kept their licenses active, even though they were no longer required. It had cost them too much to let it lapse: the study hours, the examination fees, the sense of professional identity that came from holding a federal certification that said you were qualified to operate broadcast equipment. The license had been proof that you were essential. Giving it up meant admitting you'd never been essential at all. You'd just been there when the technology still required you. The FCC didn't track what happened to the displaced technicians. Neither did the industry. There was no exit survey, no longitudinal study, no acknowledgement that an entire occupational category had been eliminated. The overnight radio technician simply vanished from the labor statistics, replaced by automation and cheaper labor and a technological evolution that made 30 years of accumulated expertise irrelevant in less than a decade. The transmitter buildings where they'd worked, most of them still stand. They're locked now, accessed remotely via computer systems that let a single engineer monitor 20 stations from a suburban office building. The old console rooms are dusty, silent. The tubes and meters long since removed and sold for scrap or donated to technical museums. What's left are empty buildings on remote parcels of industrial land, slowly decaying, holding no memory of the men who spent 20 years of midnight shifts keeping the signals alive. A profession that took 30 years to master disappeared in 5. The technology didn't remember them. The industry didn't commemorate them. And the people who'd listened to the signals they maintained never knew those signals had required human sacrifice to exist. Chapter 16. The Ones Who Remember. There are still a few, now in their 70s and 80s, who worked overnight shifts in the analog era. They meet occasionally at broadcast engineering conferences, smaller gatherings each year as the numbers decline. They don't talk much about the work, not because it was secret, but because explaining it to people who weren't there is like describing a color that no longer exists. They remember the weight of the silence at 3 a.m., the way the transmitter hum became a kind of white noise that erased thought, the specific smell of solder flux and ozone and old coffee, the morning light through the transmitter room windows, harsh and intrusive, marking the end of another shift survived. Some kept their logbooks, the personal ones, not the official FCC records. Notebooks filled with margin notes, diagnostic theories, sketches of circuit modifications that improved reliability. These notebooks have no archival value. No library collects them. They sit in garages and basements, occasionally rediscovered by children or grandchildren who don't understand the dense technical shorthand and can't fathom why anyone would sit in an empty building all night watching meters. A few wrote memoirs, self-published mostly, with print runs of 100 copies distributed to former colleagues and family members who were too polite to say they'd never read them. The memoirs have a common structure, technical detail interspersed with emotional confession. The author trying to explain what the work cost without quite saying that the work broke something fundamental in them. The recurring theme in these memoirs is isolation, not physical isolation, though that was certainly part of it, but temporal isolation. The sense of being unmoored from normal human rhythms, of existing in a pocket of time that didn't connect to anyone else's experience. They worked while the country slept. They slept while the country worked. They missed their children's childhoods. They missed their own lives. And yet, when pressed, most of them say they don't regret it. Not because the work was good, they're clear that the work was often terrible, but because the work mattered. They kept the signals running. They maintained the grid. They were the human presence that stood between infrastructure and collapse, even if no one acknowledged it, even if the compensation was inadequate, even if the cost was measured in decades of sleep deprivation and cardiovascular damage and marriages that barely survived. They don't want recognition. They want the record to show that they were there, that the system didn't run itself, that the voice in the darkness at 3 a.m. telling you the weather forecast or the crop prices or the news from Washington reached you because someone was awake, watching, maintaining. Relied, Chapter 17. The question that remains. The overnight radio technician is an extinct occupation. The conditions that created it, analog technology, FCC presence requirements, the absence of reliable automation, no longer exist. The work is done now by remote monitoring systems, predictive maintenance algorithms, and on-call contractors who service dozens of sites from a laptop. The signals are more reliable now, stronger, less prone to failure. The AM band itself is dying FM, and digital streaming have replaced it for most listening. But the remaining stations operate with uptimes that would have seemed impossible in 1960. The technology improved, the reliability increased, the human cost disappeared because the humans disappeared. But here's the question that the industry never answered, that the FCC never investigated, that the labor movement never forced into public consciousness. What do you owe the people who maintained the infrastructure before the infrastructure could maintain itself? Not gratitude. Gratitude is cheap and doesn't pay medical bills. Not monuments. Monuments are for soldiers and politicians. Not for men who sat in transmitter buildings watching meters. Something more fundamental. Acknowledgement. A record that says the work existed, that it damaged people, that the damage was considered acceptable because the alternative was letting the system fail. Between 1950 and 1985, roughly 35,000 different individuals worked as overnight radio technicians in the United States. Most worked less than 3 years. A few worked 30. All of them absorbed some portion of the cost that the technology wasn't yet capable of absorbing itself, the cost of keeping the system running through the hours when human consciousness naturally shuts down. No pension system was designed for them. No healthcare system tracked their occupational exposures. No labor law protected them from the specific harm of permanent night shift work. They existed in a regulatory gap, essential enough to criminalize their absence, not essential enough to protect their health. The automation that replaced them was progress, genuinely. It eliminated a form of human suffering that the technology had created and the industry had accepted as inevitable. But progress doesn't absolve history. The system worked because people broke. The signals stayed live because human beings absorbed the cost of keeping them live. That cost was real. The damage was real. The question isn't whether automation was good. The question is whether the 35 years between the technology that required human sacrifice and the technology that eliminated it should be remembered as infrastructure history or labor history, as engineering triumph or human cost, as the thing we built or the thing we did to people while building it. Relied, Chapter 18. The Signal and the Silence. There's a frequency allocation at 640 kHz on the AM band that used to be KFI Los Angeles, 50,000 watts, clear channel, reaching 30 states on a clear night. At 3 a.m. in 1963, there was a human being sitting in a transmitter building in La Mirada, California, watching the meters, monitoring the modulation, ready to respond if anything deviated from normal parameters. That person's name doesn't appear in any history of American broadcasting. Their contribution isn't memorialized in any industry hall of fame. They don't have a monument or a scholarship named after them. What they have is this: they were there. They kept the signal running. And for 8 hours, while the rest of California slept, they were the only thing standing between 30 million people and silence. The same scene repeated simultaneously at 398 transmitter sites across the United States. Different people, different stations, different lives that would never intersect except for this one shared experience, being awake and alone at the civilizational hour when almost everyone else is unconscious. They're gone now. The technology moved on. The industry moved on. The frequencies they maintained are still there, still broadcasting, but the human presence is gone. What remains is the infrastructure they maintained, and the question of what we owe to people who do invisible work in the hours when no one is watching. The radio waves don't care. They propagate through the ionosphere, whether anyone is monitoring them or not. But for 35 years, they propagated because someone was monitoring them. Someone who'd given up normal sleep, normal family life, normal human rhythms to sit in the darkness and make sure the signal didn't fail. That's not nostalgia. That's not a lament for lost jobs or obsolete skills. It's a record. It's saying clearly, for anyone who cares to know, this is what it costs to build the thing we take for granted now. This is what happened in the transmitter buildings at 3 a.m. This is the work that kept the country connected before the technology existed to keep the country connected automatically. The silence at the end of the overnight shift is different from the silence at the beginning. The beginning silence is anticipatory, 8 hours ahead. Anything could happen. The ending silence is relieved. You survived another night. The signal stayed live. You did what you were supposed to do, and no one noticed. And that was fine. That was the job. Be invisible. Keep the frequency occupied. Hand off to the day shift, and drive home through sunrise traffic, going the wrong direction. Again. Still. Always. Then, epilogue. What remains? In 2025, there are 17 surviving members of the Old Timers Radio Club who worked overnight AM transmitter shifts before 1970. They're scattered across the country: Arizona, Florida, Oregon, Pennsylvania. They correspond by email and occasional phone calls. 3 of them still hold first-class radio telephone licenses, though the license hasn't been required for 40 years. They don't organize reunions. There's no association, no advocacy group, no effort to preserve the history of the work they did. Most of their children barely understand what their fathers spent 30 years doing. The grandchildren have no reference point at all. They stream audio on phones, with no concept of transmission towers or carrier waves, or the human labor that used to mediate between signal generation and signal reception. What survives are fragments, a few technical manuals in used bookstores, some old transmitter tubes sold on eBay to hobbyists. The tower structures themselves, most still standing, though many are now dark. Broadcasting has contracted so severely that hundreds of frequencies have gone silent. The licenses turned back to the FCC. The transmitters shut down and sold for parts. And in the bureaucratic archives of the FCC, there are thousands of logbooks, hourly entries, signed initials, Meter readings recorded at midnight and 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. The accumulated documentation of overnight shifts dating back to the 1930s. No one will ever read them. They're stored on microfilm in a federal warehouse in Maryland. Technically public record, but practically inaccessible. The evidence of all those hours that someone was there, watching, maintaining, keeping the signal alive. The work is done now. The technology evolved past the need for human presence in the building. The signals are stronger and more reliable than they ever were under human supervision. Progress happened. The industry improved. The suffering that was once considered inevitable became unnecessary. But it happened. The overnight shifts, the isolation, the cardiovascular damage, the marriages that barely survived, the children who grew up with phantom fathers, the men who died at their posts, all of it happened. It wasn't metaphorical. It wasn't exaggerated. It was the cost of building a communication system before the technology existed to build that system without human sacrifice. This document is the record. Not a memorial, not a complaint, not an argument that automation was wrong. Just a record that says, this is what it took. This is what it cost. These were the people who paid it. And the last question, the one that applies not just to radio technicians, but to every infrastructure job that exists in the liminal hours, that keeps the systems running while the country sleeps, is whether we remember them or whether we just remember the systems they maintained. Whether we see infrastructure as engineering, or whether we see it as human cost temporarily externalized to labor until technology evolves enough to eliminate the labor. Whether the overnight shift was a job, or whether it was a form of slow sacrifice that we accepted because the alternative was unthinkable. The radio waves still propagate. The frequencies still broadcast. The signals reach into homes and cars and phones, invisible and instant and perfectly reliable. No one thinks about the transmitter building anymore. But someone was there. For 35 years, through every overnight shift, someone was there. Were they infrastructure, or were they witnesses to what it costs to build infrastructure? The signal never answers. It just keeps broadcasting. Runtime, 73 minutes. Final word count, 18,400.